Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first of three sessions of the UNI Family Business Center Board Bootcamp. Um, so we will have two more sessions after this. This one is focused on board basics, so our basic training, and the second one we will have on, let's see, June 30th, another Tuesday, and that will be focused on uh, family on your board. And the third one will be July 21st, and that is focused on independent directors on your board. And as a reminder, we will be recording these sessions, so you'll be able to share them with your family later or refer back to them if need be. And we also have a Board Bootcamp workbook that we've developed, and Katie will be posting the link in the chat if uh, when she gets that going. And it will be applicable for all three sessions. We won't be going through it step by step during these sessions, but it'll be a good tool and resource to go through with your family. And as we go, please ask questions in the chat. I'll monitor those, and we will have some time for some Q&A at the end. And so this session, like I said, we'll be going over board basics. And before we dive in, I have the pleasure of introducing Jennifer Pendergast, and she has spent her career deep in the world of family enterprise, and she's a consultant, professor, and an author, and that's how I found her. I was reading the Building a Successful Family Business Board, and thought it was very well written and had a lot of great information, so I got a hold of her. So she'll be joining us today, and welcome, Jennifer. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. It's a pleasure to see all of you this morning. Thanks for joining us. I am in screen share mode of a full slide here, so I can only see a couple of you. But just in terms of managing the session, like Kristen said, please, if you have any questions, post them in the chat. If they're relevant to what I'm speaking about at the moment, Kristen will break in. If not, we'll hold them till Q&A at the end, but really want this to be as interactive as possible. As Kristen said, I come at this from a number of perspectives. I spent the past 25 years consulting with business owning families, everyone from first generation entrepreneurs to fifth and sixth generation families that may have more than 100 owners. Along the way, I've gotten to know some wonderful, wonderful families, including some great ones in Iowa, from the Vermeer owners to the Pella owners to the to Wells Dairy, which unfortunately is not owned by that family anymore, but an Italian family. But some great family business stories there, and actually probably. The reason that Kristen's request caught my attention is I was born in Newton, Iowa, and both my parents came from Iowa families, and so I have the state is near and dear to my heart. So it's really great to be here with you today. Um, I'm not going to go through a litany uh, of my actual resume, but I will tell you a little bit about my perspective on boards. So I don't teach full time anymore, but I'm trained to be a college professor. And when I did my work at Wharton, the business school at University of Pennsylvania, I focused on the role of boards of directors and how they provided accountability for shareholders. And so that really got me interested in this whole notion of governance and how who's really the boss of the boss. So who oversees the CEO, who makes sure that things are being done in the best interest of the owners of the company. And so that translated then when I started working with family businesses, and I have done everything that you could think of related to boards with families, including working with families to think through, is this the right time to set up a board? And if so, what do we want that board to do? Who do we want to sit on it? To actually helping people recruit those independent directors. Then, if they decide to have outside people serve on the board, creating criteria and processes for figuring out what family members will sit on boards, For people that have had boards around for a while, doing board evaluations to see if they're working effectively and identify areas for improvement. Um, I am an adjunct faculty member. I was full-time for several years at Kellogg, the business school at Northwestern. I don't teach day to day in the MBA classroom anymore, but I do lead a number of executive education programs where we bring in families for a week at a time to the campus on different family business related topics. I do one in the fall every year called Family Enterprise Boards. And so that's really a week-long deep dive on all the topics that we'll talk about today. And through that class, I get an opportunity to see lots of interesting cases of different families, including a lot of international ones, which is pretty interesting too. And then last, as Kristen mentioned, several years ago, I got the opportunity with a couple of colleagues to author a book called Building a Successful Family Business Board. I put family enterprise here because that's kind of terminology we use now to talk about all the different things families may own together. Um, and one of the things I won't dive deep into here, but one of the interesting questions for a lot of families is what do we want this board to be the board of? So we may have an operating company who does a certain thing, but maybe the family owns some real estate together. Maybe we have some investments on the side, or maybe we have a sideline business in something else. What is this board actually going to be overseeing? Is it one of those things? Is it all of those things? So that's the question around what an enterprise looks like. One of the lessons you'll hear me keep coming back to here is, if you were a public company, you would have to have a board and it would have to look a certain way. Only certain people could sit on it. It would have certain jobs that it had to do. It would have to report on certain things. But because my assumption is the vast majority, if not all of you are private companies, you get to choose what you want your board to do. You're really the architect of that. And so the first question you really have to ask yourself is, what do I want this to accomplish, right? And what do I want it to oversee? And how do I want this? I think about it as a tool to add value for both the owners and the business. So how do I design it in a way that it can add value for both the ownership group and for the business? So with that, maybe I'll kick off. I just alluded to this, right? There's a lot of different kinds of boards, and you get to actually choose how you want to use a board. Legally, if you're a corporation, you have to have a board. Somewhere on paper, it says I have to have this many people, and this is what they do. But practically, that doesn't actually mean a lot for a lot of people. Um, but that's your fiduciary board, the ones who are legally liable and have certain responsibilities. Um, you may have it a fiduciary board. That's something you could create one that's more robust if it's just on paper. What does that mean? That's a group that has legal control of the business, also liability if anything goes wrong. And if you're a private company, that liability exists just like a public company. And it exists for all the directors. So interesting case of what you would not want to happen. Purdue Pharma that got caught up in the opioid crisis, their independent directors, even though it was privately held, were actually sued. And the family directors had conveniently stepped off the board right before that happened. So the independent directors were left holding the bag. So just because you're private doesn't mean that the rules don't apply about being a fiduciary. Um, what does it mean to be a fiduciary? There's a very limited set of like legal responsibilities. That would be I can hire and fire the CEO. I can decide if we're going to take money out of the business, so distribute it to owners or not. I could decide if we're going to sell the majority of the assets of the business. Um, but other than that, you don't have a lot of legal authorities unless the owners grant them to you. And sometimes people will say, well, I don't want to have a fiduciary board because then they could decide to do something I wouldn't want them to do as owners. But truthfully, the owners elect the board. So if you didn't like what they were doing, you would just choose not to elect them. So you still retain control as owners. Um, in the fiduciary board, you could decide to have independent directors or not independent directors. So you can have a fiduciary board and have it be all owners of the company and management. But hopefully, I'll make the case today for why having independent members on your board can actually be a really valuable tool. So by independent, what I mean is people that aren't at all related to the ownership group and don't have any ties to the company, so aren't getting any form of compensation from the company other than being compensated as a director. Um, an alternative to fiduciary is you could have an advisory board. So you could say, I'm not going to give these people legal authority, but I'm going to bring together a group of people periodically to serve as sort of a kitchen cabinet to provide advice to me. That says advise, should say advice, provide advice to me. But they don't have any formal decision-making authority, right? But I'm still going to listen to them and bring people around that I think are trusted and wise that can give advice to me. And frankly, sometimes for people, that advisory board is just as impactful as a fiduciary board. The key is if you bring smart people into a room and if you listen to them and take them seriously, you will be getting value from that, certainly. And then the last thing to think about is some people say that that the board itself, the goal is for me to not so much bring in independent outside perspectives, but to make sure that all my owners are aligned on what they want from the business, that we take a step back and think about the longer term, not just about the day-to-day operations of the business. So they create a board that's all of their owners or family members, all of them are selected, that they bring together maybe quarterly to talk about the long-term direction of the business. It's a way to inform and educate owners who may not be in the business day to day about what's going on. But the key is that we're trying to get ourselves out of the mode of thinking about just what's happening tomorrow to what's happening longer term. Um, and sometimes people will, if they don't really have any operating board at all, start out by creating a family board and then add independent directors to that over time, or sometimes people will actually have two. They'll have a family board that's meeting and doing the legal things that they want it to do, and then they'll have an advisory board that's separate, that's advising the CEO or the management team. So, like I said, there's can be a lot of flavors to this, and it really, which is why you really need to start and think about like, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish with this, right? What's the purpose I have in mind of doing this, and then how do I design around that purpose? So why do people have boards? And I guess that's on the right hand, like, why would I want to do this? But also, what have I seen as the kind of reason that people kick this off in the first place? Why do people come to the conclusion that this is a good thing for me to do now? Frequently, as in a lot of changes that occur in family businesses, it's around generational transition. So it could be that I'm the matriarch of a company. I've been running it for several years, and I'm ready to step back. One of my children is gonna um, take my place, and I feel like they need a support system around them to help run the business better, or I want other advisors in place to help them make sure that they have mentorship and that they've got support they need to move forward. So that would be one generational transition. Another big piece of generational transition is if I move from a situation where all or most of the owners are employed in the business to a generation where many are not. Um, that is often a reason that people create a board, because there are these owners that are no longer in the day to day that are saying, wait a minute, I want to make sure that management's interests are the same as my interests, that someone's watching out for me. And that this isn't being run solely for the benefit of the owners who are in the business. So that's a really frequent one. That's a tipping point. If I go from a percentage of the majority of owners in the business to less than that, that I start thinking about a board. A big one as well is that people move to their first non-family CEO, because they'll say, okay, in this case, really, who is the boss of the boss? Because I was okay not having a bigger boss of the boss when the owners were the boss, but now that they're not, who's overseeing this person? And that is a really common reason too. Um, Other reasons could be there's a major shift in the strategy of my business. So, as an example, I worked with one of the kind of iconic leaders in the beer industry, who started one of the big brands you would know, that before we got into all of the microbreweries that we have now. And they were seeing a shift away from beer as a beverage, and a shift away even from alcohol in younger generations and a change in beverage distribution, consolidation of the distributors around the country, which, by the way, have typically been big family businesses, right? And so they really wanted outside counsel in what are other people doing? How do we move through this industry evolution? I've also seen people as retail has gone more and more online. Smaller consumer products brands trying to figure out how to sell through Amazon as opposed to just through Target and Lowe's and Home Depot and Walmart. And what do I do to make that happen? I want advice there. So any big strategic shifts in an industry could be a reason that I want to bring in outside counsel. Um, you may also have stakeholder pressure. We've had a few people come to class at Kellogg that have said their bankers actually said, we want you to have independent directors. So they were much more likely to loan the money. You could get pressure from, I wouldn't say this is necessarily pressure, but a lot of times people will find if they're trying to recruit top outside talent to their companies, that people feel like a family is more committed to that business and more committed to operating it objectively. If it's a signal, if I have a board that sort of I'm committed to run a business a certain way, so that could be a reason from an employee standpoint that you might want to do this. And then VUCA, I just have it, the world is highly uncertain and volatile and complex right now. And I think people are more and more figuring out that they don't have the answers to stuff. So the board meetings that I've had the pleasure of sitting in on for families over the past few years, as you might imagine, a lot of conversation about tariffs and their impact, a lot of conversations about AI and its impact, about inflation, fuel prices, and all of those things. And people like having a group of people around to talk about stuff like this. So a lot of different reasons could serve as the catalyst. Maybe the book could be a catalyst, Kristen. Maybe being on the call today could be a catalyst. Those would be good things. So why do people want to do this? First and foremost, I think a board's job is to try to bring objectivity into the room. One of the greatest things about family businesses is you can sit around a table with an executive team and they can tell you that they have hundreds of years of experience in this industry. That can be the best asset you ever have. It can also be a great hindrance because you've tried everything, you know this industry, you have certain assumptions about how things that are done that you're unlikely to challenge as a group. And you often have families tend to be pretty loyal, have longer term employees. And so you have a group of people who all think alike. So decision making improves with outside perspectives and also with people that are willing to say, hey, have you ever thought of this before? Or maybe ask the dumb question that's not so dumb. So that is a really good reason to have a board. Boards also tend to formalize processes. When I came from big corporate America into family businesses, it was fascinating to me. I'd go into a company that I perceived as really large, very sophisticated, and they wouldn't have a budget or report on financials even at all. And I was like, how can you do this? But the truth of the matter was the owner or owners had it all in their head. They could run it that way. It was fine. They didn't have a strategic plan. They didn't have a lot of checks and balances in the organization. And a lot of people find that when you bring in a board, it forces you to do some of these things. Maybe I don't have a really formal process for evaluating acquisitions or big capital expenditures, but a board will ask questions like, well, what's the return on that investment going to be? And it helps you to kind of formalize or professionalize your decision making. It may also be that I just need strategic insights per the strategic shift. Like I'm looking for an outside perspective on how other people are doing something. That something could be business related, industry related. The something could also be something related to where you are as a family or ownership group. So I've seen people create boards and then actually look for independent directors who have worked with a family business that has been through its a change of owner, change from uh, a family CEO to a non-family CEO, as an example. So, what does that transition look like? How do you manage that well? And that's the expertise they're seeking in a board member. Um, And then the last thing I'll say from a practice standpoint is creating a board really does create credibility with stakeholders. Like I said, it could be funding sources, could be customers, could be employees, it could be the rest of your ownership base feels like, okay, I'm willing to submit to outside scrutiny of what I'm doing, and I think that that's a good thing. So I've never seen someone put a board in place and for it to send a signal of something negative externally. So just a few thoughts there on why you might want to do this. There's actually, when we wrote the book, we started with a chapter on objections. We're like, okay, well, let's just out of the box say, what are the reasons people don't want to do this? And let's get there. So hopefully we overcome that. So there's probably other stuff in that chapter, Kristen, that maybe the why people don't that you could overcome. I think sometimes the why they don't too is people are like, I don't know how to do this, or it's going to be hard to do this, or it's going to cost a lot to do this, or I'm not going to be able to find independent directors to do this. And I think you've got an upcoming webinar on the independent director piece, so I won't dwell a ton there, but I will say, having recruited a lot of independent directors, there are wonderful people out there who love to serve on family business boards because you generally treat your employees well, you're deeply invested in your communities. You have a long-term perspective. You have interesting strategic questions to answer. So don't sell yourself short if the reason you're considering not having independent voices on a board is because you think you won't be able to find them, because you will.
Yeah, and we do have a board matchmaking program here through the center, so I'm here to help and find those independent directors for you. I think it's a pretty simple process really for them.
Yeah.
So
I think that's the least hard part, frankly, is it's getting to the point of wanting to do it that may be harder, but once you get there. And then I think I don't want to undersell the fact, after working with families for 25 years, I know that getting everyone in an ownership group or a family to agree on something is no small task. So often that's why as well we can't get everybody on board with the idea that we want to do this. And that one I truly understand.
yeah, I imagine
Um,
everyone thinks it's a good idea, but just the whole road ahead, that whole process seems so daunting and
Yeah, and
that seems
managing
down the
it and
road.
the time commitment. And it is a time commitment, frankly. So I will tell people where I think some people are not ready is if you're not ready to commit the time to, really think through an agenda and have materials prepared for a board, just getting them together is not going to take as much advantage of them as if you're willing to make that investment. So we want to get a sense of who's here. So Kristen just launched a live poll because this will give me an idea of where you are and also maybe an opportunity if we have some people with boards already in place. I'm going to call on you and say, hey, can you share your experience with other people in the room? So everybody familiar with how to respond to these? Anyone? Yell at Katie or Kristen if you don't know how to do it, but otherwise we'll open this up for just a minute and we'll do a couple other live polls throughout the session. There may be other reasons too, where or other categories you'd put yourself in, and I welcome you to share that in the chat or raise your hand and let us know if there's not a response there that fits who you are. All right. Well, that's actually great to see that we've got not quite half of you are here have a board but want to improve its effectiveness. So I really tried to thread the needle, not just on how to set this up, but how do we think about agenda? Sometimes effectiveness is about having the right people in the room. Sometimes effectiveness is about making sure we're right talking about the right things. And sometimes effectiveness is about having the right culture in the room, and we'll talk about all of those things. And hopefully by the end, we should have done a post and exit poll, Kristen. We could see if our on the fences increase or decrease. If they increase, then Kristen will not have me ever back to talk again. So I've confused you more than I've helped you. Great. Well, thanks for responding. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how what boards do evolve just as ownership groups evolve. So one of the things that I find interesting is if you had a public company board, or if you serve on a bank board or a nonprofit board, they tend to be fairly stable over time. And I don't say that to say that the membership of them doesn't change. They do, people move in and out, but the composition of them stays pretty much the same. So if you're a public company, typically the CEO sits on the board, maybe one other officer. Used to be the chief financial officer. That's now not legal for the chief financial officer to sit on the board. So maybe the president of the company and the CEO, and then everybody else is an independent director. And that stays pretty much the same. Someone rolls off, we put a new one on. Family business boards tend to evolve and continue to evolve even over 100-year or more time spans. So what does that look like? If you start out with a controlling owner, one person in charge, first generation typically, that owner is going to be in charge of everything. They're going to lead what the strategy is. They're going to set the culture and the values of the organization. They're going to design the governance structure and lead it, whatever it is. Maybe they have an advisory board. Um, Probably not, but maybe they do. And oftentimes that's friends of theirs that they just pull together for advice. Um, as you move to what I would call a role of more operating owners, so maybe we have a number of owners and they're in leadership roles in a second generation. So all of the siblings go to work here, or most of them do. That's where you may start to move to have either an owner board or an advisory board, but you're still going to have the owners are setting the strategy, they're setting the values, they're leading the governance, they're really active in the day to day. If you start moving more to the right on this chart, which typically happens over generations, you start to have people that aren't working in the business who are owners. So second generation or beyond, even second generation, I may have a sibling or a couple of siblings who don't work in the business, or maybe none of us want to work in the business. What does that look like? Then maybe we become an, a board where we're just in the role of advisors, but not running the day to day. That's where you might have a board that has a majority of the owners. So I have four kids and one of them decides to run the business. The other three are not involved at all, but I've given the board to them, the business to them equally. They each own 25%. High likelihood in that case that all four of those siblings, because they each own 25% of the company, would sit on the board. But then maybe those three siblings that aren't in the day to day say, I'd like to have a couple independent advisors here to be a check and balance, to tell me what's going on in the world, to make sure we're doing the right thing. So I still have a board where the majority are owners, but I may have some independents. How does the owner's job change in this case? I'm not necessarily leading the strategy of the business or setting the values and culture if I'm not there day to day, but I am guiding, I'm giving input, I'm contributing to it, and I'm still leading the governance. Where things really start to shift is when I have owners that aren't involved in a board capacity, aren't involved in the business at all. Hopefully, I have them in this column of active owners, which is I don't have a formal role, but if you have family meetings, I show up. I show up at company events. Um, I show up at the company picnic. I really care. I'm a cheerleader for the business. I contribute where I can. Then my role becomes very different. I should understand the strategy because I'm an owner of this. It matters to me. Hopefully, I really care and I want to contribute to what the culture and the values of this place are. I support the governance, by which I mean I vote for the board and if they ask for input from owners, I provide it. But I'm really to the point where I don't have much of a say in kind of how the business looks from a strategy, culture, values standpoint. At that point, it's where if I start to see that I have most of my owners in this active owner or investing owner bucket, that's really where I start to have more independent directors involved typically. And then if you get to the place where you have a lot of owners who really just don't have the time or attention or care to give to the business, this is not my thing. I inherited this. I get a dividend. That's great. I'm unhappy if it gets cut. Um, and I'm really just kind of an investing owner in this. I accept the strategy. Hopefully, I understand what the culture and values of it are. And hopefully, I accept how it's governed, but I really don't have a voice in it. Where it becomes problematic is where those investing owners are maybe not supportive. They're questioning the strategy. They don't necessarily understand why the business does the things that it does. And if they get to that point, certainly it's valuable to have independent directors to provide some sort of credibility that we have good decision making. Um, you'll see that I have this bar at the bottom. Over time, your percentage of owners is going to skew to the right, just by its very nature of the fact if I have 50 owners, it's unlikely that all 50 of them are working in the business. They certainly can't all serve on the board. So they're going to be a bigger percentage to the right. And I have that without pruning because some people like one child buys the business from their parent and then it recreates moving to the left, right? But assuming that you don't do that, you're more likely to skew to the right. And the more likely you are to skew to the right, the more likely you are to need or want to have independent voices in the room. I'll also say, and this isn't really a topic for today, but there is a huge risk in a whole bunch of people populating this very right-hand side of your chart. And so it's something that's more around family engagement and family governance and creating family councils and family communication and a lot of other stuff you guys probably talk about through the center. But it's worth thinking about if you could map out your owners, where do they sit on this chart? And do I worry that over time we're skewing too far to the right? Okay. So one of the things you need to think about when you create a board, or frankly, when you're trying to make sure it's most effective, is am I really clear on what the owner's role is going to be, the board's role, and management's role? And when you first set up a board, it's really important to think through how am I going to define for the board itself what its level of authority and responsibilities are, right? So I mentioned right at the beginning, you get to decide to some extent what goes in these columns. Um, so I encourage you to think about it. What I put here is what you might typically see, right? So owners hopefully aren't just telling the board, you go figure out the long-term vision for this place and the values. They should have a voice and a role in doing that. Typically, owners, I would hope, are creating what I'd call some sort of guardrails. We don't want to do this. We never want to be in this industry. We never want to have debt more than X amount. We never want to own a minority position in a business. We never want to go out of this geographic footprint, or we must do this. We must never sell this legacy asset. We must never, have a layoff, whatever those things are that owners would have some voice in what we really must do and won't do. Ideally, your owners are also saying this is an investment. If you've ever sat down with a wealth advisor, an investment advisor, they say, okay, let's talk about what are your liquidity needs? What do you expect from your portfolio of stocks and bonds? Both what do you expect it to return to you? How much risk are you willing to take on? And then do you need to get money out of this over time to pay for your kids' education, to do whatever, right? So what are those financial expectations I have of the business? It's healthy for the owners to have a conversation about that as a group. Um, Owners should think about what use of their capital is. Like, how much money do I want to keep in and out of this business? Do I want to invest in other things together or not? Um, Owners select board members, right? You have an opportunity to uh, uh, vote for the members of the board of directors, both your family members and non. And then typically, even if they don't have the legal authority, people wouldn't make a major strategic shift in the business without asking the owners. Um, what's the board do? It's overseeing strategy and performance. I would also say on strategy, it's really weighing in ideally on big strategic decisions. It's responsible for making sure you have a good executive team in place, that they're held accountable, that we're evaluating risk effectively, that we're spending money the right way. Hopefully they're really reaching out and caring about what owners think. What's important to owners? Is this what they would want us to do? And then, first and foremost, although it's at the bottom of the list, really, I want them to be providing wisdom and insights. What's the outside voice that I'm bringing in? What do they know that I don't know that I can really leverage? And then what does management retain the right to do? I mean, they should be defining your strategic direction with input from the board. leading the business, developing plans, reporting performance, managing resources, and really driving business results, right? Where I see people get sideways is either if they're not clear on what belongs in each bucket or where they start to bleed. I will tell you, I didn't really talk about this, but at the beginning, like why create a board? But oftentimes you start to see people create a board because they need this column in the middle. So they have owners that aren't in the business anymore. They're on the left-hand side of the chart. They have management trying to do their job, but the owners are getting more involved in the business than is helpful to management. So I'll give an example actually of a very large poultry processing family that I knew and worked with. And there were a lot of owners not in the business, and they would come to meetings with management and say, I don't know why you package that in this many pounds. I saw it in the grocery store. No one's going to buy that, or you should do this. And totally ignoring the fact that management had a huge marketing department. They did surveys of customers. They had all this data. They knew what competitors did. They knew what their pricing was. But because I'm an owner, I feel like I have a right to say these things, or I have a right to walk the floor of the business and tell people certain things that I think they should or shouldn't do. So the board can create an intermediary between owners thinking that they have a right or a need to say things to management that may be a little bit disruptive. Sometimes families will, I hear people say, and I'm a little hesitant to say this because I think it does a disservice to families, but they'll say that the role of the board is to keep the family out of the business. I think the role of the board is to make sure it's clear what owner's job is and that they're doing it well and asking owners for appropriate input, but also hopefully making them feel comfortable that things are well run so I don't have to get into the nitty-gritty details. So just an observation. Um, so what do you need to get started? And I would say for those of you that 40% that are like, we want to make this more effective, um, I think sometimes why it may not be effective is these things are not actually in place. And so I would encourage you all to think about, and first and foremost, by the way, that it's not just because it looks interesting on the slide to have the checks fade on the right. I felt most adamant about the ones on the top that are the darkest colored ones. So that's why they're in this order. So first and foremost, you need to be really clear as an ownership group. What is it that I want? What's the purpose? Why did we create this board? And what value do we want to get from it? And if you don't have a clear answer to that question, or if the answer might have changed over time, or if the ownership group has evolved, we've had a board for a while, now we have a younger generation of owners in, making sure that everybody is clear on what we want this thing to accomplish. And I should say that owners are aligned on this, and then management agrees and supports that, right? So really important to take a step back to kind of first principles of what are we doing this for? Um, Also, to be really effective, have to have a commitment to transparency. So if you are not willing to share with your board exactly what's going on financially and operationally in the business, I think that's a problem. They cannot be effective if they don't know truthfully what's going on. And sometimes that transparency is not people don't want to share stuff. It's even that they just don't have reporting in place in such a way that the board can really make effective decisions. And sometimes I've seen that's actually visibility into the overall enterprise. So here's an example, a family that was had fast food restaurants. They own the brand, they weren't franchised, but what they did is they had like 50 locations, and the real estate was owned separately by the family, not within the actual operating company. And so they used the real estate as a way to get cash flow from the business to the owners. So the manager of each of those units paid rent to the family on the real estate they owned. The problem was that the board only saw the operating company, and it saw that the business was losing money. What they didn't realize is those rents were probably higher than they should be, and the family was making money over here. So they needed to see the whole system to understand, does this make sense or not? So sometimes that's the transparency piece that people need to see. Um, You need to have, and this is a piece that really is an investment. Make sure you have good enough financial and operating reporting that people truly understand what's going on. So do we have good management information? And that's not just like monthly financials, but operational management information that's helpful to people. Um, the reason that these get lighter down to the bottom is I think to some extent, if you don't have the couple at the bottom or you're on your way there, that a board actually be able to help you get there. So one of those is management capacity. If I say, well, I don't think management really has the ability or the time to be able to put together information for the board, that may be a signal that I really need to think about upgrading my management team or having different people in place. And it could be that getting a board started could provide me some insight into what that team should look like or how we should be doing things differently so management has capacity. So it's a chicken and an egg. Maybe the board could help me get there. Very much a chicken and the egg on a defined strategy and strategic plan. I mean, ideally, your board would come in the door and you'd be able to say, this is the direction we're headed. And they'd say, ooh, that doesn't make sense. Or if you really want to go there, here's a few things I think you need to be doing. However, if you're not clear on what that is going forward because there's a lot of change going on, it could be that the board could be a really useful tool in helping you assess that. And so I wouldn't say you need to completely know exactly where you're going for the board to be there. It could be they're one of the tools that help you figure out how to get there. So again, for all of you, regardless of whether we're trying to make this more effective or we're thinking about kicking off, starting at the top of really making sure you're aligned on what you want the board to do. And then from the effectiveness side, if you recognize there are things I want it to do that it's not doing, then let's talk about some of these other things for the rest of the day about things it could be doing that maybe is helping me get to the place where it's adding the value that I want it to. Okay. So starting decisions, if I'm going to kick this off, I talked to Chris and I was like, what would be most helpful practically to people is, okay, if I want to get going or if I want to recess, what do I need to do? I've been beating a dead horse on the purpose piece, so I'll just, last time I'm going to say it, I think. Um, Purpose is really important to start. Then once I have purpose, I can start thinking about composition, which is if that's what I want this to achieve, who do I need in the room to do that effectively? And then how do I need to set it up once I have those people in the room and what are the specific topics we need to talk about? So I'm going to go through each of these in a little more detail on the next slides. I lied. I actually am going to talk about purpose for one more minute. But really what I have here is it's in the book, but if you are going to either start recruiting independent directors or go out and look for directors of your board, I strongly encourage developing a document called a board prospectus. It outlines, what stage is the company in ownership group? Why are we seeking a board right now? What kind of people do we want on the board? What do we actually see the board doing day to day? How many meetings are we going to have? So I could really look at that as a recruiting tool and say I do or don't want to join this board, right? All three of these purpose statements are actually from real board prospectuses. So these were taken out of recruiting documents that boards used or families used to go out and seek independent directors. In the one case on the left, they were creating an advisory board. So they just had owners oversee decision making. They were creating an advisory board. They didn't have a board at all. Um, so you'll see an interesting point at the bottom of this. The other ones are things we've talked about before, advice, risk, accountability. But the bottom one, prepare family members for owner and leadership roles. This was a case where they had younger family members in their 20s that they wanted them over time to move into senior leader roles. And they thought adding independent advisors to help support them as kind of mentors and guides in the room would be helpful. Second one, adding independent advisors. So if you notice, they'll say, um, we're adding independent advisors to this board that we created when family moved out of management. So that was their catalyst. And then what they say is we have experienced significant growth and we want to figure out kind of how we build the infrastructure to do that going forward. advisors that we want to add. And then the independent director ones is, look, we have an active board of family shareholders. Our industry's evolving, and we need people that have independent ideas from other industries to provide insight into strategic thinking. So we want to see how people do things in other places. So those are kind of examples of how you might define a purpose at a very high level. So for those of you who have boards, for those of you who don't, for those of you who are even on the fence, I would like to understand a little more about where you think a board could add value. And in this case, you can pick as many as you want. And I may stop after this one as well, actually, Kristen, and open up if anyone has anything in the chat they want to say about what's another reason. Be encouraged to hear from other people. What are other reasons that you think a board would be helpful? Are we starting to get enough responses in to see what's going on?
Yeah, I think so.
We got. Oh, so interesting. So three-quarters of people said generational leadership succession as well as strategic crossroads for the business and close behind sounding board for strategic direction. Um, so it sounds like a lot of these apply, but not so much overseeing non-family leadership. It sounds like people may not be there yet. Before we move on, I'd be curious to hear from people. Anyone, I think if you raise your hand, the little hand emoji, you'll go to the top of the queue, so we'll know to ask you. But anyone have anything else that's like a real reason this would be helpful to you that isn't captured by these? Just curious to hear if there's anything we're missing. Anybody? Okay, well, I will assume that we've covered the landscape then. Um, and maybe I'll spend a little bit of time on the end talking more about how you can use this to help generational leadership succession or digging into that a little bit. Just as an aside, I took a quick look at the chat while you guys weren't here, and I think Kristen had, or Katie had posted in case you didn't all see it, that all the slides will be available afterwards. So if you think this content's helpful, certainly it's there to share. So we said purpose value to start off with, and that guides me to think about who do I need in the room to be able to do what I want it to do. And typically a board might have a composition of maybe some management team members, some owners, and maybe some independents, right? The reason I have owners on the top is I find that most often family boards composition is tied to how many owners I think should have seats on the board, and then I back into the rest of it. So say I have four siblings that all own the business equally. I think as a result of that, they all have a right to sit on the board. I want some independent advisors, but I feel strongly that they shouldn't be the majority of this. So I end up with seven. I end up with four owners and three independent advisors. And I'm not thinking so much about what skills do I need in the room. I'm just thinking about these owners have a right to these seats, right? So I think a really important conversation to have with yourself and then to think about through generational transition is what's the model for what I see as the right positions for owners on the board? Do I feel like owners have a right to a board seat because they have a certain ownership stake? Do I feel like each branch has a right to have a voice in the room? Little quick aside on that, that's important to think about as you think about that, although hard for families to get their heads around. Board members are accountable to all the owners. It's not like a representative government where I go back and I lobby for my state that I do or don't want corn subsidies or fracking or whatever else I may want for my state. You represent the whole. And so it's important to think about that even if you have people saying, well, each branch deserves to have a voice here, that ideally it's not four people from four branches advocating for their branch. It's people thinking holistically about what's best for the business and the owners. But oftentimes people do have branch representation on the board, particularly um, in earlier generations. It's interesting. I've just been working with a family in the fifth and sixth generation, and they still thought of their family as literally the three names of the branches in G2, which were like 80 years ago at least. Um, all three had been sister daughters, so none of them had the founder's name. So they were talked about literally these three last names as the branches of the family. What they realized by the fifth generation is there's a whole bunch of third cousins in this branch that don't even know each other and don't necessarily have the same interests. So this is sort of silly that we're setting up the board this way. So they let go of that construct. It's also important to think about, do I feel like it's important for owners to have a majority of the board? I will come back to what I said before, which is you still retain control of the business, whether or not you have a majority or a minority of seats. So I would think more about who's the right people to have in the room than do I need to have a majority? Because what I find, if people say we have to have a majority and we have to have branch representation, what this family was seeing over time with these three branches is they had one branch that no one had had as many kids. So there were like less than half as many people in that branch as these other two. And they had these board seats they were supposed to fill, but they didn't have anyone to sit in them. And so they had people there, but they weren't adding any value. And frankly, they didn't even want to be there. So is that serving me well, or is it better to think about what I need from the owners in those roles to be able to do that effectively, and how many do I actually need? Um, some people will say that if there are owners employed in the business, they really want them on the board because they know what's going on. Other people say Jennifer's 35 years old and she works in the business. I don't know that it's best for her to sit on the board because her boss's boss does not sit on the board. So she's going to be privy to information that the person that reports to her is not. So maybe that's not such a good idea. So that's a big decision to make. And then do I feel like people, if they have above a certain percentage of ownership, just have a right to sit on the board because they own that many shares? Look, that actually happens in public companies too. So it may be that I say the reason people are sitting there is they have a right to have a voice in the room. Um, on the management side, you can really do what you want. Um, it's unusual not to have your CEO of a company have a seat on a board, but some families actually don't have the CEO have a seat on the board. They report to the board. Sometimes people will have a CEO who's the chair of the board. Sometimes people will have those two roles. Sometimes people will say that there's the CFO always sits on the board, or that there's a CEO and then there's a president behind them. Some people actually have retired executives sit on the board. I'm really hesitant about that one because imagine your retired CEO is sitting on the board. It's harder for your current CEO to have a conversation with the board members if there's someone overseeing them that created the strategy before, that knows the business really well. So that's something that's tough to consider if that person is the best person to sit in the room. But you do need to think about, who do we want to sit on the board? Sometimes as part of a leadership succession, someone's the president, but they're going to be next in line for the CEO. I add them to the board because I think it's important for them to have visibility into what the board talks about. And then on the independent side, we already talked about, are they advisory or fiduciary? But what I would encourage you to think about is less about, we can have two independents or we can have three independents, then what are the skill sets that I want independents to bring? And then those become like archetypes or profiles. I want someone from the real estate industry who's focused on design, build, construction in the residential market in this part of the country. I want someone who has really good financial acumen. I want someone who has moved their business from selling through retail to omni-channel online. So what's kind of like my fantasy football, my dream team, the people that I would want in the room. And then I can back into how many people is it going to take to actually get to do that. Um, One of the things that I enjoyed the most when I was helping people recruit independent directors is when we go out and they talk to a number of people and they'd say, well, you know what? We thought we wanted two independent directors, but I talked to these three people and they are all so amazing. I think we should hire all three. And then what they'd realize is it's less about the number of seats and more about the capabilities that these people bring to the room. So I encourage you to think with an open mind about that one as you think about the number of independence that you might have. I also, there's a caveat there, which you guys can talk more about when you talk about independent directors. But if you're looking for an independent director to solve a business problem you have, like we don't have good financial skills, your board can't solve that for you. That's either we need a consultant or we need to change our executive team. Now, my board can help me highlight an issue, but they can't fill in a gap of something that I really need day to day, right? So it's important not to rely too heavily on that. And then the last piece I'll say on independence is some people are cannot imagine having someone in a room that's not somehow known or connected to them. And I understand that, but I will say that I have worked with people who've had those first independence that they've gone and they use someone like Kristen or they use someone like the role I used to be in helping recruit these people. And they're like, wow, there's actually really interesting, great people out there. I don't necessarily need to have spent my whole life knowing them to understand that they're aligned with my values. You have to be really good about learning how to interview and ask the right questions to make sure that they're a good cultural fit, not just they look really great and smart on a piece of paper. But I will tell you, it gets less scary to have someone you don't know in the room once you have them in the room and realize that that can be valuable.
Yeah, and in the workbook, we do have, a
Yes.
matrix of skills. So there might be some things you didn't even think about you might see as valuable to have on your board. So just identifying those gaps in in what skills you currently don't have and what you might want and what kind of information you'd want to gather um, for those board seats. So.
Yeah, Kristen gave me the opportunity to see the workbook, and I think it's really, really helpful. So I would encourage you all to look at it, whatever stage you're at. And then don't discount that you may have owner directors that also fill some of those buckets too. This family that I was most recently working with, the fifth and sixth generation one, they happen to have some non-employed owners in the business who like brought incredible skill sets to the board themselves just from what they did in their careers. So it's not to say those all have to be filled by independents either. Okay, so I think it's really important to think about, and I believe as an appendix to book or the table or something, there's actually some content on a family director job description. So, like, what do you need to be able to bring to the table as a family director? Because we're expecting different things of that person. They're unlikely to be the leader of a CPG company that does X. If you have that person, great, but unlikely, right? Or less likely. So, what am I looking for? And one of the things that's always a question in families, because frankly, it can raise contention is we're in the third generation. You know, you're not qualified to serve on the board unless you have an MBA or a business degree, or you're an accountant, or you work for this kind of company. Is that really what we're expecting of owners, or are we expecting some of these other things? Like they have good judgment, they're trusted by the family, they have high EQ, they're diplomats. They've demonstrated success and commitment and what they do. They've demonstrated commitment to the family. And frankly, is it that they need to come into the room with a certain level of business acumen, or do they need to be willing to commit time to educate themselves? That's, I think, a real key difference. Um, so a couple examples of next generation directors I've seen join businesses, join boards of like fourth and fifth generation companies. It's been so interesting. The first fourth generation family member in a really, really large business that was asked to join was actually a physical therapist. So it was this was the poultry processing business. You would think this woman doesn't know anything. Everybody trusted her to be in that role. She showed up for all of the family meetings. She had committed time to be on the family council. She was wise. She listened to others. She gathered input from them. She was good at raising questions. Um, and she said, I get it. I'll go to this board training course. I'll sit down with the CFO and walk through Finance 101 to understand how our financials work. Because in the end of the day, you can't sit in the room as an equal participant if you can't read the financial statements, if you don't understand the dialogue in the room. So the expectation isn't you're coming in and you're being silent and you can't participate. It's I'm willing to get to spend time to get up to the speed of the level of being able to participate effectively. So, and then that sets expectations for, I hope that for people, they don't have kind of when they add independent voices, that they don't have like a two-class system where it's like, well, the independents, they're the smart ones. The owners are just supposed to be sitting here and listening. I really do want people to weigh in. Because why? Because I want them to be the voice of ownership. So good independent directors, if management says we want to do this acquisition, may ask the question, well, what do the owners feel about that? Is it that a direction they want to head? And your owner board members in the room are supposed to be wise enough to know either we think we know where the family stands on this, or we should actually go back and ask the broader ownership group what they think. Because our job is to represent that. Their communication back to the family. They assess whether we need to get broader ownership input. They also spend time to prepare. And if they are operators in the business or have been, they're willing to get out of that mindset of what's happening on the plant floor, what's happening in the field, to think about this more strategically. What are some challenges with family directors? Understanding this fiduciary responsibility from a couple standpoints, right? Like, um, this is what I want as an owner versus this is what's best for the business. This is what my branch wants. This is what my dad would have said. Also, the fiduciary responsibility for confidentiality. I've heard people say, I know you're not allowed to share anything in the room, but I just told my sister and my husband and my kids that doesn't count. It counts, right? They're not in the boardroom. If you're going to lay off a whole bunch of people, or if you're thinking about acquiring another company and it's going to affect them or moving into a new market, that may not be something that we should share with everybody in our family outside the boardroom. Um, Family director moving away from expected seats to best in seat. Do I expect I'm rolling off the board now that my daughter should get to sit in that seat? Or do I realize that that's not really how this should go? We should go back to looking at the skill sets and having a clear process for how to get people there. Um, how do I do, how do I educate and develop family directors so that I have a big enough pool of people able to do this? My perspective on this is I would hope if you're a later generation business that everyone in the next generation would feel like maybe they had a shot at being on the board if they were willing to commit the time to do it. So how do I create a level playing field that everybody has the opportunity subject to their willingness to spend time on it? There's a business case that you can get through Harvard Business School that we wrote on Pella Corporation and their board around the development that they expect of family directors to move into their seats is kind of interesting. Those are, if you're willing to go on the Harvard Business School website and pay $4 or $5, get access to that case, it's a pretty interesting one to read. And then sometimes there's also competition for family board seats. So if there are more people that want to sit, then there's space for that can be complicated. And then you really need to get to do I have a more formal process for how to do this so people feel like those got there fairly, not that there was an unfair process and Jennifer got to pick her daughter or however that might have happened. Okay. Similarly, independent directors, and again, this is in the workbook, you're going to talk about this more, but what am I looking for? I'm looking for not just someone who has a rock star resume and good experience. I want them to understand the board's role and what good governance looks like. So I have had people who have been former CEOs who come in the room as independent directors and they're horrible because they think they should go get to tell people what to do. They're not used to that role. I've had people who don't really appreciate family ownership. So they come from more of a public company mindset, and they don't appreciate that families may care about things that are non-economic or may be slower to make decisions because they need to get consensus. Um, they need to be willing to dedicate time. There are some great people out there that have retired that sit on like 5 or 6 boards. I always say that you want their mind share as an independent director. So if they're reading the Wall Street Journal, if they're reading your Business Courier or whatever, the first thing they think of when they think of it is, oh, this story relates to Daniel's company. I'm going to send him a note. Not, I'm thinking about 5 or 6 other people before I think about this place. So am I dedicating my mind share to them? Um, you also want someone who can weigh in broadly. So one of the downsides I've seen people try to fix gaps in their business, and this was a few years ago, but it was when a lot of people were moving into big systems integration projects and bringing in enterprise tools like ERP systems. And they were like, oh, we have to get this guy from Microsoft to sit on the board. And so they had like this guy that was like not a junior level, but he was not a senior executive at Microsoft. And the entire time, he would veer people off in the direction of these conversations that were not helpful. There was about 10% of the conversation in the board that he could be helpful on, and the other 90% he was actually distracting them. So can someone talk about HR issues? Can someone talk about strategic issues? Do they understand managing risk? Do they understand financials? Um, my mentor and colleague, John Ward, who wrote the book with me, who is the namesake of the center at Kellogg that I ran, used to say, what I want is a similar risk-taking peer. So someone that sat in the seat that I did and had to make the same decisions. And that's frequently a CEO or a senior leader of another similar business. Um, and then do they have experience with current and future challenges? We are going to, for the first time, have more of our business manufactured outside the country than in the country. Did someone else do that before? Did someone else have their first non-family CEO before? So who's crossed this bridge that I see that I'm looking to cross? When I worked with people on thinking about who they wanted for independent directors, I said, what are the biggest strategic challenges you're going to face in the next 3 years? Well, let's think about who would be helpful to have to help you make those decisions. Then you got to be clear on them of what I expect of you. You know, um, are they going to beyond the boardroom invest time to get to know the ownership group? I sometimes have people that will have independent directors come to a shareholder meeting or have dinner with the broader ownership group. Um, do I want them to have that connection? Do I want the door to be open from them to talk? That's really a choice. I want them to be objective. I think one of the things that I see that is a challenge sometimes with independent directors is they'll say, well, even if I'm a fiduciary board, they'll say, well, the majority of owners are represented in the room. If this is really the direction they want to go, I'm not going to stand up and pound the table for that. So if they really think they want to stay in this business, even though it's generating these returns or the writing's on the wall that strategically it's going to be very hard to succeed because of competition that's entering, that's really their choice. They seem like they're going in with their eyes open. And owners are saying, I really want you guys to push back on me on these things, but they just don't feel like they've been given the permission, or they're a little concerned about the political dynamics in the room if they raise some of these issues. So I do that. There's a couple of things you can do to solve that. One is being very transparent with them up front about what you want. And the second is maybe create separate spaces to allow them to raise issues. So for instance, a lot of boards effectively use what I call an executive session, and people use it differently. But they'll have a session where maybe just the CEO is sitting with the board and not any of the other management team in there. And then they'll also have a session where it's 100% the board and the CEO, no management in there at all. Have one case where the board is chaired by a family member. They actually have a non-family CEO. Board's chaired by a family member, but they use one of the independent directors as a lead independent director. So he sort of operates like the chair, but he's not that in name. He reaches out to all the independent directors after the board meeting and will say, hey, how are you thinking about this? Are there issues we should be discussing? I served on a board where the CEO would come back to us all as the independent directors and kind of take a temperature check in between board meetings to see how we were feeling about things. So if board members are for whatever reason hesitant about the dynamics of speaking up, create ways that they can speak up. Otherwise, you're not really taking advantage of them. Um, so that speak up courage is one of the challenges. Another is if this person truly came from the outside, how do I build trust in the ownership group? And that's around the more informal interactions with people. There's also a problem of balancing multiple stakeholder viewpoints, right? If ownership that runs the business is adamant about wanting to keep all the money in the business because they want to grow it, because they see the opportunity, and owners outside the business are more risk averse. My job as the board is to figure out what the right answer to that is, right? And that can sometimes be difficult to balance. So making sure you have a full picture of what the owners want and then can really think objectively about that is important. Okay, so some practical setup questions a year. These are the more logistical stuff, right? How many meetings are we going to have? That can be a pretty easy one. I mean, typically people tie it to cadence of business reporting, depending on the kind of business you're in, but pretty frequent would be quarterly. If you meet less than 3 times a year, people aren't going to be able to consistently know and remember what's going on. Remember when they come in the room, this hasn't been something they've been thinking about all the time. So you're going to have to re-educate them. I think more than 5 times a year, and you're probably getting more into the weeds of operational details. I do see boards that will do, one of the boards that I work with, they reduced, I think we now have 3 meetings a year, but in between those meetings, they actually have an update call with management for an hour and a half where they keep track of what are the big projects going on in the business and ask any questions. So that way, when they get in the boardroom, they're actually prepared. So I've seen people do where they have intermediary check-in calls. This also all goes out the window if there's something huge going on. Like during COVID, I saw boards meeting pretty frequently because they were trying to figure out what to do. Or right after tariffs got put in place, people were meeting more frequently, usually virtually, not calling in-person meetings to figure out what to do. Then there's a real question of who attends. I have been to meetings where there are 40 owners of the business, 2 sit on the board, and the board meets in front of all the rest of the owners sitting in the room. It's a really interesting dynamic. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. For those families, it worked, but what would happen is major, more confidential decisions of the board got pushed into another session. And over time, then the owners thought the board didn't decide anything because they didn't see what they were really deciding. So that's the path you could go down there. I work with one board where next generation members in the business can't sit on the board, can't be in the board, but they're invited to attend the board meetings as observers. Some people will have next generation family members actually have rotating observer seats to more as communication and learn what's going on in the business. And then there's the whole question of who of management is invited. Yeah, I work with one board where literally there'll be like 20 management team members in the room or dialing in while we're having the board meeting. What we learned over time is independent directors were really hesitant to say anything in front of the entire management team. So then they learned that maybe the CFO, the general counsel, the CEO, and then whoever was presenting, like a whole team would come in from marketing if they were doing new branding thing, but then they'd leave, was a better way to do it because anytime you just have a really big room, people are going to be less likely to speak up. So really thinking through who's in the room is an important piece of having candor. Are you going to have committees? Are you going to take some specific issues of the board and target those into not full board? Common things would be compensation committee that does the performance evaluation of the CEO and sets salaries and bonuses every year for senior executives. Sometimes an audit committee to oversee the formal audit reporting. Sometimes people have a nomination and governance committee that would be responsible for identifying new directors, doing those things. The benefit of that is you do some of the kind of nuts and bolts business of the board. You can segregate so not everybody has to do all the stuff and they can report back to the board. And then a really critical question is who's going to actually decide the agenda for this? If I have a non-family CEO, do they decide the agenda or do the owners decide the agenda? Do the directors have any opportunity to weigh in? Because I will say, I think where I see people most frustrated about the value they're getting out of their boards is they just aren't having the right conversation in the room. It's not about the people, it's about the conversation. And the agenda really sets the stage for that conversation. So speaking of agenda, I want to talk about a few things on agenda. The biggest thing, I always say there's a great thing that you can do called auditing your agenda. So for those of you who have board in place, I encourage you to do this. Go to past agendas, and I want you to think about a few things. One, how much time was management talking versus the board? It's number one question to ask yourself. If 80% of the conversation is management talking and 20% of the board, how am I getting anything out of the board if they're not talking? It's very hard to get anything out of them. So I've seen a lot of boards move effectively over the past several years to limit reporting. As an example, one CPG company, and I think this is pretty cool, what they do is they have presentations that management puts together, like PowerPoints, maybe 10, 15 slides, and they actually video themselves on Zoom presenting the slides. Hey guys, here's what's going on in my product line of the business or in this geography of the business. Here's what's going on with this new marketing campaign. And before the board meeting in this portal, I think it's like a week in advance, we all get the information and then they'll tell us this is 2 hours of Zoom, just so you know to prepare. So then when everyone comes in the room, we don't go over the financial reports. Everyone's already read them. And if you had any serious questions about them, you threw them out to the CFO ahead of time. Hey, I'm totally confused. Why did this happen? Right? Hopefully they know enough to tell you that in their Zoom video. But if they don't, you don't come in the room with questions of fact. You don't come in the room with people presenting facts. You come in the room to have a discussion. And that has been really helpful for them. The other audit issue, I would say, is the fourth one with the target here, the bullseye. What percentage of the topics on the agenda or the content was related to operating versus strategic decisions? So am I really picking the 2 or 3 big things that we need to be talking about longer term to help figure out where to go? So here's an example. I was working with a family that owns, manages, and builds hotels. And traditionally, what they had done is they would get a partner in a new geographic market that was like a family with capital or family with land, and they'd partner with them, and that family would either contribute money or land. They would build the hotel and run it. So each of their properties had partners with them. The tactical discussion in the boardroom was we can't find a partner in this market, or the partners that we have in our existing market, they don't have succession plans and their kids don't want to take over their businesses, or they don't want to take the risk anymore. So they're not going to keep investing with us when we do new properties, right? So tactically it was, I have this hotel I want to build in this place. Board, help me think about a partner. But then we did this enterprise risk assessment and we said, what are the bigger risks to this business? And it was the way we have funded these businesses in the past isn't going to work going forward. And what it unearthed was a board conversation about, let's talk about what are other sources of funding. If we really want to rely on other families, are we actually investing time to go to markets and get to know other families and build relationships with them in advance? That was a strategic decision. The tactical decision was, anyone have any ideas about how I find a partner to fund this thing? So it's thinking about how you frame something. And then the other thing that just pointed to was, do I tell the board what I need from them? So if I have this whole, I'm management, I come in with this 30-page presentation and my question is, what do you think? Or we've looked at this acquisition, we really think it's great, we want you to approve it. What am I going to do at that point? Versus what are the things that we are missing? Is this a market we should go into or not? Asking the question early enough when you're looking at a big strategic decision that they actually have an opportunity to weigh in at a point where there's something that they can do about it. But I always think in a presentation, it should come to then the last slide is here's what I could use from you, board. And by the way, on the clarify expectations, I tell the board what I am expecting them in advance. So they get the agenda, they get pre-read materials at least a week in advance. And it says in this piece of the agenda, I'm telling you this by way of education. This is what's going on in AI in our world. I'm not expecting you to do anything with it. I just think it's important to know. I'm telling this to you for your information because we're looking at an acquisition strategy. There isn't anything you need to do now, but I want you to be prepared when we get there. I'm asking for your opinion. I'm consulting you versus we're actually going to have a vote and decide at the end of this. Let's be clear about what it is. Why is this thing on the agenda and what do I actually want from the board for each of those sessions? And then the key is also that the agenda is in such a way that it provides space for discussion. So if you look at the agenda and we've got topics that are every 30 minutes, or we've got something where we really want input, but management takes up the entire time to present, then I'm not going to get any space for discussion. Um, I remember someone telling me something long ago that I apply to boards, which probably people will think is crazy. And why would I apply this analogy? So Coco Chanel was like Chanel, the brand, right? And she had a saying that you should get dressed and then take one accessory off. So it's always better to have to be, I hate to say underdressed than overdressed, like no, don't take off your pants or take off your shoes or whatever. But err on the side of having less full and allowing yourself to fill the time than more full. So if it looks like everything's 30 minutes, either you need more time or you need to realize that one of those things probably needs to go off of the agenda. Right. And then the last thing I would say on agenda is really do think about this executive session piece. I had one board where they always put the executive session where the board had the opportunity to talk to the CEO at the end because they thought it was a great way to for the CEO to get input. His management team would come in and present on different topics. And they thought, well, this is great. The management team leaves and then we can tell the CEO what we thought of that. What they realized is they never knew what the concerns were on the CEO's mind before the meeting started. So they started having a really limited executive session at the beginning of the meeting where the board just said, the CEO just with the board, here's the state of the business. Here's the couple things I'm worried about. I'm worried that Jennifer, my marketing officer, isn't really getting this thing. I'm worried that this team is doing this. Please grill these people on this topic. I'm curious to hear your insights on this, but it's a little bit sensitive in the room, so we should probably hold that to later. Um, so that people knew what to be looking for in advance. So think about how you use this session and be willing to evolve it because I think at different times there may be different uses for skinnying down. Or sometimes people will say we don't have time in the room the night before we're going to have a dinner with just the CEO and the independent directors to kind of share with each other. So think about how you use those smaller groups effectively to what you're trying to do is create more candid discussion. All right. So I want to talk just getting close to the end here, time for some Q&A, but I'm curious if your first agenda or your next agenda are any of these things the kind of key topic you would want to make sure to have on the agenda and go ahead and check as many as you want. I'm just curious about what's on people's minds. And also if there isn't something here, I'm going to open up again to see what are we missing because this is a way to educate your fellow participants. Okay. maybe this ties back to our leadership succession, ties back to our generational transition, right? And my point at the beginning that that's often a reason that people create boards. I do think that navigating through both family and non-family leadership succession is a really valuable use of your board. I also think that if you're setting up a board, I would think about what are the skill sets I need in the room to help me do that. Ideally, they'd be people that were more on the family business side. This is, Kristen, where you can probably be really helpful with your network, thinking through other people who have been through leadership successions before. So all of these very relevant issues. I have to say, sometimes there are very micro issues. I'll say just as an aside, and then I want to open this up. Does anyone have any other things? I'm a horrible multitasker, so I had to do something while you were all voting. So when I looked at my email, I saw that there was a webinar coming out about compensating family members in the business. How do we think about doing that? Sometimes people will literally have the things on their board be like, one time I worked with a family, they're like, why we really need a board is we need a compensation committee to set our cousin, the CEO's compensation in the business because it's very divisive within the family. So they started out there and then it broadened out. So sometimes these issues are just things that are very difficult for the family to manage. How can I bring in some objective voices to that? So curious, anyone else, things that are big things on the board agenda or that you foresee being on the board agenda that weren't on this list? Anyone? I find it hard to believe that I covered the landscape, but we shall see. Okay. So, trying to think. I have one last slide, and then we're going to open this up to Q&A. I'll pull down the slides so everybody can see each other. You're more accountable if I can see all of you versus two. So kicking off your board, what's important to do to set them up for success? I can't say enough about kind of board orientation and onboarding. It used to be a rule of thumb that people would say, well, you'll get this board in place, but you're not really going to get the most out of them for like 2 or 3 years. I do think they get more valuable over time. I don't think that you should think that I'm sitting here and it's going to be 2 years before I hear anything valuable from my board. And a lot of that can be setting them up by knowing as much as they can to get up to speed. So there are actually what I would call board portals, Diligent, what are they, Board Vantage. They can be costly. You may have WebEx, you may have SharePoint, you may have Teams within your organization. Can you create a segregated place where you can share a bunch of documents that the board can always have visibility into? What is our ownership structure? Who owns what? What's the management? Like, what's the organization chart? What are the bios of the key people? What are the past 5 years of financial reporting? What is some operational reporting? How do we break down in terms of customer segments of what we sell or geography of what we sell? What are the trends in those things? Do we get routine industry reports from sources that we could post for them there too? So where's all the educational? We just took the management team through a training on AI. Can we post the slides there? So if they're interested, they can see them, right? We're doing a rebranding with the marketing agency. Here's the information we're getting from them. Where can we put as much information as possible for them to really get a read on what's going on within the business? That's one piece. And someplace that you don't just give it to them once or give it to them in a binder, but that it's a living place that you can continue updating information. You'll also find that sometimes independent directors, particularly with different profiles, will be interested in different things. The marketing guy will want a deep dive on certain things. The financial guy will want different things. I have people say, oh, but if we put together a board packet with all that, it's going to be 500 pages. What I would say is, if it's in a portal, you can do the deep dives in each of the area and people can gravitate towards the stuff that's most valuable to them. So don't say no to anyone's request, but don't make it a pre-read for everybody, right? Then how do you introduce the board to management? If you didn't do it through the recruiting board member process, make sure they have time to spend with each of your kind of senior leaders independently to understand their perspective and scope on the business. This is actually useful for family board members too, if they're not involved in the day-to-day, to be able to do that. Um, Make sure you're not just providing today, but history and context. This is going to sound like an awful piece of history and context, but I was just starting to work with this bigger, older family, and someone said to us, it's probably useful for you to know that in these two branches, two people that at one time worked for the business committed suicide. Um, it's deeply colored how that family branch thinks about this. Or we went into this business before it didn't go well. Or once we had a partnership with someone and it went really south, so the family's really not in favor of partnerships anymore. Like, what is that history and context that's valuable? And then how do you bring ties to an individual board member's interest and expertise? So one family I work with that was moving away from selling, like I said, all in big box retail to more of an omni-channel approach, brought in this guy to join the board from a internet native brand. So they had really didn't have their own storefronts, whatever. Immediately they got that guy engaged with the marketing team and stuff they were doing there, and he loved it. The whole business loved it. It was a great, so he sort of had a bespoke assignment just for him to get to know the business. Um, I had one family where the owners were allowed to sit in on the final meeting interview of the board members virtually, just so they got to know them. That was kind of interesting. Had a family where they had the board meeting kickoff. They had it the day after the shareholder meeting so that the board could actually sit, for a dinner with the shareholders before the meeting. So how do I get to know the owners? How do I get to know management? Some bigger, like multi-unit retail brands, if they have big um, all management meetings where they'll bring together like the head of, like imagine you're Chick-fil-A and you have all these operators around the country and you have a meeting where they all come in for a meeting. Um, you bring in or you bring in your key salespeople, your sales meeting. Like, do we invite independent directors to that so they can get to see the culture and how we work? So there's a lot of opportunities. Some people will actually rotate their board meetings through various facilities if they have plants or facilities around the country to highlight different things that they do. So that's how I call it orientation and onboarding because some of that you couldn't do all before you start. But you think about the cadence of I'm ongoing in an education process with the board. And then really think about that first meeting agenda if it's new people in the room. How do I make sure that we're not so plug and chug going through the agenda that we don't have time for people to actually get to know each other? Um, I had an interesting like boot camp for setting up a first board one time that there was a non-family chair of the board. And she said, Jennifer, I want you to lead a board team building session. And I said, Oh, you mean like the board orientation? She said, No, totally different. And what we did was we went around the room and we said, What are your other boardroom experiences? And what did you think was successful about those and not? Why did you want to join this board? What do you think the value you'll add to this board will be? What would you most like to understand better? And then we actually even ask questions like, how do you participate in a discussion? And we learned that some people like process information out loud, so they'll want to talk about things. Some people will wait till they hear everybody else talk to weigh in on things. Um, we thought the person that waited till the end didn't have anything to say, right? And we cut off versus like if we understood each other and how we work and what we bring to the table. We also forced in that for owner directors, it was interesting. The founder of the business had passed away. His wife sat on the board and her stepson ran the business. Um, she had to weigh in too on what she thought she contributed to the board and what she'd most like to understand more about. It was really healthy. And so the whole kind of well, concept I'll leave you with kind of to end is a board is a really unique animal because if you think about it, what it is, it's a set of people that come from very diverse backgrounds. If you do this with independent directors, family directors, whatever, they come together very infrequently. They don't really know each other very well, and they have a really, really important job to do. So that does not sound like a recipe for success. So process actually has to be managed to do that well. So think about that. How do we overcome some of those challenges we have, and how is this board going to work effectively together? Um, Make sure that there's something to dig into in that first meeting that people feel like they're adding value. So it's not, well, we'll just spend the first, I'd sit on one board. He was like, well, the first year we're just going to educate you. And I was like, we really need to dig into something or people are going to lose their interest here. The norms I already talked about. The last is, it's going to sound really weird, Aztec calendar fairs discussion. I worked with a family in Mexico where they had actually used an Aztec calendar has rings for different things and ways you're measuring time. And what they did was there was a strategic ring of the board, there was a financial ring of the board, there was the compensations cadence of the board, like budget, or there was finance ring of the board, setting the budget, setting management bonuses, all the stuff. Each was a ring, and they had divided the key activities that happened in each of those. So here's where a strategic plan comes about. So then they backed into, based on this circle and all these things happening, when do we need the board to weigh in? And by doing that, they realized that, oh, this is the right board meeting for us to talk more about the strategic plan. This is the right board meeting for us to talk about compensation policies. And so when you get daunted that how am I going to fill up this board agenda each time, it was pretty clear that there was a cadence that certain things had to happen. And those things should make up maybe 50% of the agenda. And then we should create breathing room for the other half for big strategic topics we want to discuss. So it helped it make it a little bit less daunting to think about every time I got to start with a blank sheet of paper and think about what to do. So I thought that was really useful. All right. Last thing I'll leave you with is that is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out with any other questions that you have. I know Kristen and the center are a great resource as well, but I am always happy to have a dialogue about some of these things, point you to the way of other resources. We would be thrilled if you wanted to join us at Kellogg in the fall ever for the Family Enterprise Boards program. The book is kind of a boards for dummies. I feel like it's not very philosophical. It's pretty practical. So there's a lot of tools in there, but please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always happy to talk to people. So with that, I'm going to pull these down and see if anyone has anything to say, anything to add.
And
Questions?
I did get a couple of private questions here. So one is, how do you address conflict as you're starting your board?
That's an interesting question. It kind of depends on what the conflict is related to. If it's conflict in the ownership group, but I would encourage that don't see the board as the mediator. Um, if those family members happen to be in the board, then I think it's interesting to think about how would I lay out a productive discussion where people's different viewpoints got to be heard, but in a facilitated way, so the board could understand different points of view. The one thing I think it's not healthy to do is to hide conflict from a board, because they can't be of service. So they understand you're a family, you may not all align. It's how do you manage this? Can the board be a tool in supporting it? Do we either need to have a conversation out of the room about that conflict or actually figure out how to bring it in the room in a way that the board can be an advisor? If it's conflict around the direction of the business going forward or its financial performance, those are board related things that maybe we could have a dialogue about that would be helpful.
I think it's just pushback on getting the board started if there's a hesitancy.
Hesitancy. I do think there's a couple things I would say is really understand what that what's the objection. One of the things I always tell people in families, I tell my kids this too, they're not very good at it because 20-year-olds have a like really definitive belief that everything they know is more than your other 40 years of experience, which is my family thing. But I encourage them, even if I want to convince someone of something that I think is totally wrong, the best thing I can do is understand where they're coming from, because then I can figure out how to build my objection, right? So truly understanding what people's fears are. And the other thing I say in families is oftentimes the thing is not the thing. So what someone is telling you is not really the underlying thing. either because they're not willing to or they don't realize the historical thing that it is. The other thing I will say, sometimes it's use like networks to your advantage. Is there someone else that they trust, that has a board that they could talk to, that they don't perceive as having a dog in the fight, that could come and share with them? Could you bring a family speaker into a meeting that has a board that could share their experience? So how can I use others as a peer network? Maybe could be an opportunity too.
Okay, and I've got another private one. Is there a strategy when you have a board for a holding company? When each company and the holding company are in different markets, have their own management, and are in different phases of a business, startup versus mature and growing, is there still one board?
That to me is the most fascinating strategic question with families. Where does the board sit? So in that case, I've seen two different things happen. I've seen people say, really, the place we think it'd be most valuable is in this more mature business over here. It needs operational support of where it is. So for right now, we're going to have independent advisors here. I've seen people say that. Plus, at the holding company level, we should have an owner board because they're overseeing, should we keep investing in this one? If this one isn't working, should we take money from this one and move this one over here? Should we cut this one off? How do we feel about being in this overall? And the owners are deciding that. Um, and then the third I've seen is that the board with the independent advisor sits at the top level. And it's less about, is any one of these businesses operating right, then are these the right investments for us to have? And then I almost see them more like a private equity firm. Where am I going to focus my attention? What kind of businesses do I want to be in? So I think the real question for where you put it is, where do I feel like the pain points are where I need the most insight? I also worked with one business. This is super interesting, and they talk about their stuff all the time and do like family programs, so I don't hesitate to talk about them so much as an example. And they'll present at Kellogg. They traditionally made fire trucks. The truth is, because we're really good at fire prevention now, like we don't need as many fire trucks, which is great for us. And when they go out, they're typically not going out for fires. They're going out for other kinds of emergencies, right? So they started moving into other things like providing first line defenders in military and other disciplines, right? So all of a sudden they had like a military sector of the business and then the traditional fire and then also fire retardant, like do we have sprinklers, whatever. What they did was they had the board at the top, but then they actually had advisory boards underneath. And like as an example, the military one had a former general on it that understood how to sell to the military. Was he helpful to the overall business? Maybe not so much. Although what happened is they had a couple people that they brought in because they were like super subject matter experts at those business that they realized were just really wise and they ended up moving them up to the top. But you could think about having the board up there, but having a couple key advisors sit within them if they're different. Or if you had a like venture stage, earlier stage businesses, you might group them together into a unit and have a board of that because at that phase, you're thinking about really different stuff, right? So I think it's kind of form follows function. What are the things I'm trying to solve? And then think creatively about how you might set that up.
We've got strategies for SWOT analysis for board composition. There we go.
I think a SWOT for board composition is like a great idea. If you're talking about like what I think about like strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, then how does that tie to what I need on the board, right? I think that's actually a great way to start. Um, strengths are we're really good at these three things. Maybe we don't need someone to weigh in on those so much. I don't need to double down on talent. A lot of times people are like, people desperately have to understand my industry. And I'm like, my guess is no matter who those people are, you have been doing this business forever as a family, you are going to know this better than they are. So that's a strength you have. And also love the thinking about the opportunities piece too. Like, how do we think about the board as actually adding value as opposed to just eliminating risk, opportunities to get into new markets, things we really want to try. Like that's just much more of a positive spin on it. But I do think, and then I think I think the interesting one about that is a board is a tool for both owners to make sure the business is well run, to encourage them to be aligned, but it's also a tool for management. Like, how do I think creatively out of the box? So if I were going to do a SWOT on board composition and I had a decent sized ownership group, I'd ask them to do it, but I'd also ask management to do it separately. Like, what do you think? Where could you? Because then instead of management feeling like this is a tool that's being in place, put on over me because people don't trust me and they just want to force me to report to them versus they're going to try to invest in people to help us be more successful. If I could think about that, who would I really want in the room?
And then compensation levels for boards. One, corporate size. Number two, industries, variation, or competitiveness.
Two things tend to drive board compensation. One is company size for sure. And I think that has to do with the complexity or the role. Like if oftentimes people will say, I'm a $500 million business. We're hoping to get to $1 billion in the next 7 years. Then what I really want is a board member who's at $1 billion or above in their business that can kind of see what are the systems I'm going to have to put in place to get there? What are the roadblocks I'm going to face? um, that board member probably comes from a different level of compensation in their life and the opportunity cost or the trade-off to give this time to you than someone in a much smaller business, right? So that's why size matters. Then the other thing is time commitment. It's very different to say that I'm going to have a board that meets 3 times a year for half a day versus I'm going to meet 4 times a year. We're going to have committees the day before. It's going to be a full day. So you're really going to be 2 days at a minimum. I'm bringing the board in from around the country, so there's going to be a travel day. Sometimes it's, my business is kind of remote and they're coming in. So like, how much is it that they're actually going to have to spend? I want them to chair a committee. That's going to be extra time. So you really start thinking about what's a fair compensation for someone's time. I don't think that industry drives it as much, except for the standpoint of what caliber of people am I looking for? So if I'm a small CPG company, but I want to get people that have worked at Google and P&G and whatever, there may be a higher price tag for those people than people who come from industries where they aren't necessarily in big corporate America. There are compensation studies, some of which I could share with you. They're all over the board. When we did the book, you'll see there were people who had like huge businesses that literally paid people nothing on their board. And then there were people in medium-sized business that pay people a lot. And so, and it wasn't necessarily tied to the business size or anything. So I think what you want to do is make sure that people feel like you're being fair. And I think anything less than kind of $40,000 a year per person feels like they're not gonna, just by the time they get to you and the time they're gonna spend is gonna be tough. But I know families that spend 3 times that amount, and you'd be surprised for the size of the business that they do. What you don't want is compensation to be the reason someone would rule you out to do it. What you also don't want is compensation is the reason that they are doing it. And by the way, losing the compensation means that they're not going to be willing to tell you the hard thing. So they're going to keep doing it for the compensation. The other interesting compensation question is, do I compensate owners who are on the business? Ideally, or who are on the board. If they're not in the business at all, I kind of feel like you should compensate them almost the same as independent directors, because otherwise I'm sending the signal that you're here, but your voice doesn't really matter. And then I'm also saying you have to get up to speed to be able to have a voice. Now that will differ if some people will say, but they get this massive dividend and they're being compensated other ways. So there's like no rule of thumb that I wouldn't break based on looking at a situation. Um, but I do think for the independent directors, you've got to think, that you'd be willing to be in that a little sort of $40,000 range and up if you want them to take the job seriously. They're not doing it for the compensation, though. I will tell you, if they are, then that's not the right person, because hopefully they're making a lot more than that. And if they say, well, I could make more on a public company board, and they could get on that board, then they should go do that, because it doesn't seem like they're doing it for the right reasons.
And then another private one, who should be responsible to initiate the process of starting a board?
This is always the great question in families for everything, right? Well, like, whose job is that? Sometimes it will come from management. We really think this is important in a CEO. will push for it. Sometimes it will be a group of owners. Maybe there's a family council and they get together and they think this is important. So I actually think it could come from anywhere. I do think that leading the charge, if you don't have it yet, is probably if you have a family CEO, it may be them starting it with other key ownership members. If you have a non-family CEO, it feels like you really need ownership representation to do that, I feel like. Um, because you don't want the CEO hand selecting who their board is if they're um, but I do think the key is you're going to have the owners aligned. So whoever you could I've had families where they actually came to Kellogg, went to a program, and then designated a small committee of owners to work with a consultant to figure out what they needed to do. So in their case, that worked because they were already in the third and fourth generation and they didn't have a board yet.
Okay. That's all the questions I have in the chats. Is there anyone else that has a question for Jennifer? Okay.
Someone did at one point ask a question for a smaller firm with less resources, what might a simplified version of this look like? I think you can have an advisory board that's fairly informal and find a couple people even that you don't have to pay a lot of money. That's where I'd go back to all rules are meant to be broken. If it's more people that you know, it's people closer in the community, but you really want to have a strategic dialogue. I found very few people that aren't willing to help people out. So it might be that you just start there with more informal conversations and see where that goes. But I do think saying we don't have a lot of resources, that there's ways that you can get around some of this having to be kind of big and complicated and scale it to the size you need. Because I will say that, and this is where I'll sort of pound the table for the last time, I don't think there's any situation where a group of caring, smart people in a room helping you think through the future could be a bad thing if you've got the right people. So I wouldn't hesitate for anyone to do it, but you need to scale it. You're right to the what you have capacity to do. So. Well, with that, please do reach out. I mean that seriously. I wish you the best of luck, Kristen, with the rest of the series. If other questions come back after that, please let me know. I'm happy to help my fellow Iowans however I can.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and that's been a lot of great information. And a reminder, next session is June 30th, followed by July 21st for the third session. So with that, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to meet you. Bye.